September 19, 1945. Camp Como, Mississippi. A group of 32 German women stepped off a transport truck into humidity that felt like a wet blanket, their Wehrmacht auxiliary uniforms still bearing the dust of their capture 3 weeks earlier in Bavaria. They were Nachrichtenhelferinnen, signals auxiliaries who had operated radio equipment and cipher machines for the German military. Now they were prisoners of war in a nation they had been taught to fear and despise. What they were about to experience over the next 18 months would shatter every assumption Nazi propaganda had drilled into them about American capitalism, gender roles, and the treatment of defeated enemies. These women represented a small fraction of the approximately 2,000 German women held as prisoners of war by the United States, a number dwarfed by the 371,683 German men in American custody. But their experience would prove equally transformative, revealing contradictions that Nazi ideology could not explain. They had been taught that American women were frivolous and weak, that American capitalism exploited workers mercilessly, that defeated enemies could expect only brutality. Instead, they would discover they were to be paid for their labor, treated according to the Geneva Convention, and exposed to a society where women held positions and possessed freedoms unimaginable under Nazi doctrine. The processing began immediately, conducted with an efficiency that surprised women accustomed to German military bureaucracy. American female officers, wearing ranks equivalent to those held by men, conducted medical examinations and identity documentation with professional competence. The presence of women in positions of authority within the American military structure itself represented something the German women had never witnessed. The Wehrmacht had relegated women strictly to auxiliary roles, denied them officer status, and ensured they remained subordinate to male authority at every level. Yet here were American women wearing captains' and lieutenants' insignia, giving orders to male soldiers who obeyed without question. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. The barracks assigned to the women prisoners exceeded anything they had known even as free German citizens before the war. Wooden structures painted white, each building featured electric lights powered by the camp's generator, indoor plumbing with hot and cold running water, and heating systems for the coming winter. Individual beds, not bunks, with mattresses, sheets, blankets, and pillows. The contrast with their final months in Germany, where they had lived in makeshift quarters, often without heat or adequate water, surviving on rations that barely sustained life, could not have been more stark. But it was the announcement during the first orientation briefing that caused the most profound shock. A female American officer, Captain Sarah Morrison of the Prisoner of War Division, explained through a German-speaking interpreter that prisoners would be offered work assignments in accordance with the Geneva Convention. Those who chose to work would be paid 80 cents per day in camp scrip, redeemable at the camp canteen for personal items, toiletries, writing materials, and small luxuries. The announcement was met with stunned silence. Else Kruger, a 28-year-old cipher clerk from Hamburg, later recorded in her diary, which she kept throughout her captivity, that she initially believed this was some elaborate deception. Nazi propaganda had taught that American capitalism was the most ruthless form of economic exploitation, that workers were treated as disposable resources, that defeated enemies would be forced into slave labor without compensation. The concept that prisoners of war, enemies who had fought against America, would be paid for their work seemed to contradict every principle of wartime treatment she understood. Surely, she reasoned, there must be some hidden cruelty behind this apparent generosity. The Geneva Convention of 1929, which both Germany and the United States had signed, established specific provisions for the treatment of prisoners of war. Article 27 stated that belligerents might utilize prisoner labor, excluding officers, for work that was not directly related to war operations. Article 34 specified that working prisoners should be paid at rates determined by the detaining power, though the convention did not mandate specific amounts. The American decision to pay prisoners 80 cents per day, while businesses paid the government 45 cents per hour for prisoner labor, represented substantial compensation by contemporary standards. What the German women prisoners could not have known was that this payment system had been carefully calculated by the American War Department to serve multiple purposes. It maintained Geneva Convention compliance, provided prisoners with means to purchase items beyond basic necessities, reduced disciplinary problems by giving prisoners economic incentive for cooperation, and generated revenue for the government that partially offset camp maintenance costs. In 1944 alone, the government had received $22 million from businesses employing prisoner labor, while estimating savings of $80 million from using prisoners in military installations. The work assignments offered to female prisoners differed from those available to men, reflecting both Geneva Convention restrictions and American social conventions of the era. Women prisoners could not be assigned to agricultural labor in the fields, as male prisoners routinely were. Instead, they were offered positions in camp administration, food service operations, laundry facilities, sewing rooms where they repaired uniforms and linens, medical facilities as orderlies and assistants, and educational programs as instructors teaching German language to American personnel. Greta Hoffmann, a 32-year-old radio operator from Munich, was among the first to volunteer for work assignment in the camp hospital. She had received basic medical training in the Wehrmacht Auxiliary Service and hoped to use those skills. What she encountered in the camp medical facility challenged everything she believed about American healthcare and treatment of prisoners. The hospital, a substantial wooden building with separate wards for different conditions, was equipped with modern X-ray equipment, surgical facilities for emergency procedures, a fully stocked pharmacy with medications including penicillin, and examination rooms with equipment superior to most civilian hospitals in Germany, even before the war. American medical personnel, both male doctors and female nurses, worked alongside German prisoner medical staff with professional respect that surprised the German women. The American nurses, many of whom held officer rank, directed medical procedures and supervised treatments with authority that German women had never wielded in medical settings. In Germany, nursing had been considered appropriate women's work, but it remained strictly subordinate to male physicians. Here, American nurses made independent medical decisions, gave orders that doctors respected, and operated with professional autonomy the German women found remarkable. More shocking still was the treatment prisoners received as patients. Hoffmann observed American medical staff providing the same quality of care to German prisoners as to American personnel. Penicillin, which German forces could barely obtain for critical cases, was used freely for prisoner infections. Dental care included fillings and extractions performed with anesthesia. Chronic conditions received ongoing treatment, rather than being ignored as they would have been in German POW camps. Surgical procedures were performed when medically necessary, not merely for life-threatening emergencies. The first payday arrived 2 weeks after the women's arrival at Camp Como. Those who had volunteered for work assignments received camp scrip in denominations that could be spent at the camp canteen. The canteen itself represented another revelation about American abundance and prisoner treatment. Shelves stocked with toiletries, soap, shampoo, toothpaste, and cosmetics in quantities that seemed wasteful by German standards. Writing materials, pens, pencils, and paper for correspondence. Candy, chocolate, and sweets that had been unobtainable luxuries in Germany for years. Cigarettes, both American brands and German cigarettes imported specifically for prisoner purchase. Personal items like combs, mirrors, sewing supplies, and magazines. Ilse Werner, a 24-year-old telecommunications specialist from Berlin, spent her first wages on soap, real soap made from fats, rather than the synthetic substitutes that had been standard in Germany since 1942. She later wrote to her sister, in a letter that was screened by American censors but allowed to pass, that the soap produced actual lather, smelled of flowers, and represented a luxury she had forgotten existed. This small detail, the availability of quality soap for purchase by prisoners of war, revealed something profound about American productive capacity and priorities. The food provided in camp mess halls delivered perhaps the most visceral demonstration of American abundance. Prisoners received rations based on American military standards, which exceeded what German civilians had eaten since before the war, and surpassed what German soldiers received even during Germany's peak military success. Breakfast included eggs, either scrambled or fried, bacon or sausage, bread or toast with real butter, and coffee made from actual coffee beans rather than the roasted grain substitutes that had been standard in Germany. Lunch and dinner featured meat, beef, pork, or chicken in quantities that would have sustained a German family for days, fresh vegetables rather than canned or preserved substitutes, potatoes prepared in various ways, bread baked fresh daily in camp kitchens, milk, fresh milk from refrigerated supplies, desserts, cakes, pies, and cookies that seemed impossibly indulgent for prisoner rations. The waste troubled the German women deeply during their first weeks. American regulations required camp kitchens to prepare 10% extra food to ensure adequate portions for all prisoners. This surplus, combined with American eating habits that didn't require consuming everything served, resulted in significant food waste. Garbage containers filled with partially eaten meals, discarded bread, vegetables left untouched because prisoners didn't care for the preparation. For women who had watched German civilians starve, who had themselves experienced severe rationing, who had seen children searching for scraps, this casual waste seemed almost obscene. Margaret Schmidt, a 35-year-old administrative clerk from Stuttgart who had managed supply records for Wehrmacht communications units, volunteered for assignment in the camp food service. Her experience with military logistics made her uniquely qualified to understand what she was witnessing. The camp kitchen operated with equipment and supplies that exceeded anything she had seen in German military facilities, even at the height of German power. Industrial refrigeration units, unknown in most German installations, preserved fresh meat and produce. Electric mixers capable of preparing dough for hundreds of loaves operated continuously. Gas ranges with dozens of burners cooked simultaneously for the camp population. Automated dishwashing systems cleaned thousands of plates, cups, and utensils daily. But the supplies themselves revealed the most profound truths about American agricultural and industrial capacity. Schmidt kept informal notes, later preserved in her personal papers, documenting deliveries to the camp kitchen. In a single week, during October 1945, the camp received 1,200 pounds of beef, 800 pounds of pork, 600 pounds of chicken, 1,400 dozen eggs, 900 gallons of milk, and quantities of fresh vegetables that would have fed a German town for a month. This was for a camp holding fewer than 2,000 prisoners and staff combined. The mathematical implications were inescapable. If this single prison camp, one of hundreds operated by the United States, received such quantities weekly, then American agricultural production must operate at scales Germany never achieved. Schmidt had managed supply records throughout the war. She knew German agricultural output, understood distribution limitations, and recognized how rationing had been implemented not from choice, but from necessity. Germany simply could not produce enough food to feed both its military and civilian population adequately, even after conquering agricultural regions of France and Eastern Europe. The American casual abundance suggested productive capacity beyond German comprehension. This was not special treatment for propaganda purposes or temporary generosity that would end once media attention faded. This was standard operating procedure, the routine provision of supplies to maintain prisoners, according to American military standards. The consistency and sustainability of these deliveries week after week, month after month, demonstrated that America could feed prisoners of war, enemy soldiers who had fought against American forces, better than Germany fed its own citizens. The revelation extended beyond mere quantity to encompass variety and quality that German women had not experienced in years. Fresh fruit appeared regularly in camp mess halls. Apples, oranges, bananas, grapes, depending on season and availability. In Germany, fresh fruit had become a luxury reserved for the privileged elite by 1943. Most civilians saw fruit only as preserves or dried goods. Yet here, prisoners of war ate fresh apples with their lunch as casually as Americans had eaten them throughout the war. The camp gardens, maintained by prisoners under supervision, provided another window into American agricultural methods. The growing season in Mississippi allowed cultivation of vegetables year-round with proper planning. American agricultural extension agents, employees of the Department of Agriculture, actually visited the camp to provide advice on crop selection, planting schedules, and cultivation techniques. That government employees would devote time and expertise to improving prison camp gardens seemed incomprehensible to women from a nation where every resource was desperately hoarded for military purposes. The gardens employed hybrid seeds developed through American agricultural research programs. These varieties, bred specifically for disease resistance and higher yields, produced vegetables larger and more abundant than traditional German varieties. Chemical fertilizers, which Germany desperately needed for explosives production and could barely spare for agriculture, were applied liberally to prison camp gardens to improve yields. The casual use of resources Germany would have conserved desperately revealed priorities only a nation of overwhelming abundance could afford. By November 1945, most of the German women prisoners had volunteered for work assignments. The 80 cents daily wage, while modest by American standards, accumulated quickly for women who had no expenses beyond small personal purchases. Some saved their earnings systematically, others spent on small luxuries, items that made captivity more comfortable. The freedom to make these choices, to decide whether to save or spend, to select among options in the camp canteen, represented the economic agency Nazi society had systematically denied women. The educational opportunities available in the camp exceeded what many prisoners had experienced in Germany. American authorities established English language classes taught by American instructors, with German prisoners encouraged to attend. The classes used modern teaching methods, textbooks provided at no cost to students, and emphasized practical conversation skills rather than rote memorization. Some German women who had studied English in school before Nazi education reforms discovered that American instruction methods were more effective and less authoritarian than German pedagogy. More significant were the correspondence courses offered through American universities. Prisoners could enroll in courses ranging from business administration to literature to vocational skills, with materials provided and tuition paid by the American government. The University of Wisconsin, among other institutions, operated programs specifically designed for prisoner education. Completing coursework earned legitimate academic credit that could be applied toward degrees after repatriation. Anna Richter, a 26-year-old signals operator from Frankfurt, enrolled in a business correspondence course during her captivity. She had completed secondary education in Germany, but had been denied university admission under Nazi policies that limited female enrollment and prioritized students from politically reliable families. In American captivity, she accessed higher education denied her in her own country. The irony was not lost on her or her fellow prisoners. They were receiving educational opportunities as prisoners of war that Nazi Germany had refused them as citizens. The camp library contained thousands of volumes in both English and German. German language books had been specially imported to provide prisoners with reading material in their native Rätses language. The selection included classical German literature, technical manuals, contemporary fiction, and periodicals. Newspapers, both American papers and German-language newspapers published in the United States, were available for prisoner reading. This access to uncensored information represented freedom the women had never experienced under Nazi control of media and publishing. Reading American newspapers proved particularly transformative for prisoners' understanding of their former government. Articles discussed the Nuremberg trials beginning in November 1945, detailing Nazi war crimes with evidence the German women found initially impossible to believe. Photographs of liberated concentration camps showed horrors that contradicted everything Nazi propaganda had taught about German military honor and civilized warfare. International coverage from multiple independent sources confirmed that these atrocities were real, documented, and undeniable. Else Kruger recorded in her diary the psychological crisis this information caused. She and many of her fellow prisoners had genuinely believed in Germany's cause, trusted their leaders, and accepted explanations that their nation fought defensive wars against enemies determined to destroy German civilization. The evidence of systematic genocide, industrial-scale murder, and crimes against humanity committed by the German state in their name shattered these beliefs. Some prisoners refused to accept the evidence initially, claiming Allied propaganda and photographic manipulation. But the volume, consistency, and detail of documentation from multiple independent sources made denial increasingly difficult to maintain. American authorities did not force prisoners to confront this information. They simply made it available, allowing access to newspapers, magazines, and newsreels that documented Nazi crimes. This approach proved more effective than propaganda or coerced re-education programs. Prisoners could verify information across multiple sources, discuss what they learned with fellow prisoners, and reach their own conclusions. The truth, when documented so thoroughly, spoke more powerfully than any propaganda campaign. The Christmas season of 1945 brought experiences that completed many prisoners' psychological transformation. American religious and civic organizations, the same groups that had provided support to male German prisoners throughout the war, extended similar generosity to female prisoners. Local churches in Mississippi organized Christmas services in German, with ministers who had studied theology conducting Lutheran and Catholic masses according to traditional German practices. The familiar rituals, conducted in their native language, provided comfort to women far from home during the holiday season. More remarkably, these services were attended by some American civilians from nearby communities. Families whose sons and husbands had fought against Germany, whose loved ones had been killed or wounded by German forces, sat in church alongside German prisoners and sang Christmas hymns together. This demonstration of Christian charity toward enemies, this ability to distinguish between individual human beings and the state they had served, revealed moral principles Nazi ideology had taught were weakness, but which these women increasingly recognized as strength. Care packages arrived from religious organizations, civic groups, and even some American families. The packages contained candy, cookies, small gifts, and handwritten cards wishing prisoners a peaceful Christmas. That Americans would send gifts to enemy soldiers, women who had contributed to Germany's war effort, who had operated communications equipment that facilitated German military operations, seemed incomprehensible according to Nazi teachings about American character. This was supposed to be a nation of selfish capitalists, interested only in profit, yet strangers donated gifts to imprisoned enemies expecting nothing in return. The transformation occurring among German women prisoners paralleled experiences documented among male German POWs held throughout the United States. Both groups encountered the same fundamental contradictions between Nazi propaganda and American reality. But for women prisoners, additional revelations about gender roles and women's status in American society provided unique insights that male prisoners could not access as fully. The American female officers and civilian employees working in the camp demonstrated professional competence and authority that challenged Nazi ideology about women's proper roles. Captain Morrison, the senior American officer responsible for female prisoner administration, made decisions affecting camp operations, supervised both male and female staff, and exercised authority without apology or deference to male superiors. She commanded respect through professional competence rather than gender-specific traits. American nurses working in the camp hospital displayed similar professional authority. They assessed patients independently, prescribed treatments within their scope of practice, supervised enlisted medical personnel regardless of gender, and participated in medical decisions as colleagues rather than subordinates. German women who had worked as nurses under Wehrmacht medical officers, always subordinate to male physicians, observed American nurses functioning as medical professionals with genuine authority. Civilian women employed by the War Department visited camps regularly as inspectors, educators, and administrators. These women traveled independently, operated with professional autonomy, and exercised authority without requiring male approval. They drove their own automobiles, a sight that startled German prisoners accustomed to societies where car ownership remained primarily male privilege. They wore professional attire rather than housewife domesticity, carried briefcases, took notes in meetings, and conducted themselves with confidence born of professional training and social acceptance. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. The contrast with Nazi ideology about women's roles could not have been more stark. Nazi doctrine, summarized in the slogan Kinder, Küche, Kirche, children, kitchen, church, had relegated women to domestic and reproductive functions. Women were encouraged to bear children for the Reich, maintain households that supported male productivity, and participate in carefully controlled religious and social activities that reinforced Nazi values. Professional careers were discouraged except in fields deemed appropriate for women: nursing, teaching young children, social work supporting Nazi programs. Higher education for women was restricted, with university enrollment deliberately limited to ensure women remained in traditional roles. American women, these prisoners observed, operated within a society that imposed significant constraints on female ambition and reinforced traditional gender roles in many ways. 1945 America was far from gender equality by later standards. Most married women were expected to prioritize domestic responsibilities. Professional opportunities remained limited in many fields. Social pressures reinforced traditional roles. But compared to Nazi Germany's systematic exclusion of women from public life and professional achievement, American women possessed freedoms and opportunities that German women had been denied. Greta Hoffmann, working in the camp hospital, had conversations with American nurses that revealed these nuances. The American women acknowledged frustrations with limitations they faced, discussed hopes for expanded opportunities after the war, and expressed determination to maintain professional positions gained during wartime mobilization. But even while recognizing constraints, they inhabited a society where women's professional competence was accepted, where female authority in appropriate contexts was respected, and where individual women could pursue careers through ability rather than being categorically excluded by gender. The prisoners learned about American women's suffrage, the right to vote granted by the 19th Amendment in 1920. German women had briefly enjoyed voting rights during the Weimar Republic, but the Nazi regime had eliminated women's political participation except in carefully controlled forms that channeled female activity toward Nazi objectives. American women voted in regular elections, held political opinions openly, and participated in civic life as citizens rather than as auxiliaries to male political activity. The economic independence some American women enjoyed particularly impressed German prisoners. Women working in war industries had earned wages they controlled, opened bank accounts in their own names, purchased property, and made financial decisions independently. While many married women turned over earnings to husbands or family budgets, the legal and practical ability to maintain economic independence represented freedom. Nazi law had specifically prohibited. German married women required husbands' permission for employment and could not control their own earnings without male approval. The daily routines of camp life gradually became familiar through the winter of 1945 and into 1946. Work assignments provided structure and purpose. English classes improved language skills that would prove valuable after repatriation. Correspondence courses offered education. Reading materials stimulated intellectual engagement. Social interactions among prisoners created a community. The combination transformed captivity from mere confinement into something more complex, an experience that challenged beliefs, broadened perspectives, and forced reconsideration of fundamental assumptions. The spring of 1946 brought news of repatriation schedules. German prisoners would be returned to their homeland as shipping became available and as conditions in occupied Germany stabilized sufficiently to receive them. For male prisoners, repatriation had been ongoing since late 1945. Female prisoners, smaller in number and lower priority for transport allocation, faced longer waits. This extended captivity, initially frustrating, ultimately provided additional months of exposure to American society and further opportunities for the transformation already underway. During these final months, some prisoners were assigned to work programs outside the camp under supervision. Small groups worked in local hospitals, assisting American nurses with patient care and learning advanced medical techniques. Others worked in commercial laundries, operated by businesses that contracted with the War Department for prisoner labor. A few with appropriate skills worked in offices, performing clerical tasks under American supervision. These external work assignments provided direct contact with American civilian society and revealed aspects of American life that could not be observed within camp confines. Margarete Schmidt, assigned to work in a commercial laundry in nearby Clarksdale, observed American working women in their natural environment. The laundry employed approximately 60 women, including both white and African American workers, operating in a segregated but parallel system common in Mississippi during this era. The working conditions, while far from luxurious, exceeded anything Schmidt had seen in German industrial facilities. Ventilation systems reduced heat and humidity. Rest breaks were scheduled and enforced. Safety equipment protected workers from machinery hazards. Wages were paid weekly, in cash, with amounts sufficient to support independent living. The African American workers particularly interested Schmidt, as they represented a population Nazi racial ideology had taught her to view with contempt and fear. Nazi propaganda had portrayed African Americans as primitive, dangerous, and evidence of American racial degeneracy and social collapse. Instead, Schmidt observed skilled workers operating complex machinery, supervisors directing operations competently, and individuals with families, aspirations, and dignity that contradicted every racist stereotype she had internalized. The racial segregation Schmidt witnessed troubled her in ways she struggled to articulate. On one hand, the separation of workers by race, with separate facilities and social spaces, seemed to confirm Nazi teachings about American racial problems and hypocrisy. Yet the African American workers earned wages, owned homes, sent children to schools, and lived with freedoms that exceeded what Nazi racial laws had permitted for those deemed racially inferior. The contradiction between American ideals of equality and the reality of segregation revealed moral complexity that simple Nazi racial doctrine had never acknowledged. Conversations with American women, facilitated through Schmidt's improving English, revealed that many Americans recognized racial segregation as wrong and were working toward change. Some spoke of the NAACP, the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, an organization fighting for civil rights and racial justice. Others discussed how African American soldiers' service during the war was creating pressure for social reform. These conversations demonstrated that American society, unlike Nazi Germany, permitted public debate about moral failures and allowed organized advocacy for social change without state repression. The recognition that American society could acknowledge its own failings, permit criticism, and allow reform movements to organize openly represented perhaps the most fundamental difference from Nazi governance. German society under Nazi control had prohibited any criticism of state policies, suppressed dissent ruthlessly, and demanded absolute ideological conformity. American newspapers published articles criticizing government policies. Churches preached sermons challenging social injustice. Civic organizations advocated for reforms. This openness to self-criticism and reform, rather than weakness as Nazi ideology taught, enabled social progress that authoritarian societies could not achieve. By summer 1946, repatriation schedules accelerated as shipping and processing capacity increased. The women prisoners at Camp Como began departing in groups of 20 to 40, transported to East Coast ports for embarkation to Germany. The farewells between prisoners and American staff, particularly female officers and nurses who had worked closely with German women, carried genuine emotion. Professional relationships had evolved into mutual respect despite the prisoner-captor dynamic. Some exchanged addresses, promising to correspond after repatriation, promises that in numerous cases were kept for years afterward. Else Kruger departed Camp Como in July 1946, part of a group of 38 women transported to New York for embarkation. The train journey across America provided her final glimpses of the nation that had held her captive. Through the windows, she observed the same abundant landscape that had stunned male German prisoners since 1943, electrified towns blazing with light, farmland cultivated with machinery, factories operating around the clock with parking lots full of workers' private automobiles, highway systems carrying civilian traffic. The visual evidence of American prosperity remained overwhelming, even after months of exposure and adjustment. The ship that carried German women prisoners back to Europe was itself an American liberty ship, one of thousands produced during the war through the revolutionary construction methods that had so shocked German naval intelligence analysts. The vessel, operated by civilian crew under War Department charter, provided basic but adequate accommodations for the passengers. Meals during the Atlantic crossing exceeded what passengers expected to find in Germany upon arrival. The crew treated German passengers with professional courtesy rather than hostility or contempt, another small demonstration of American ability to separate individual human beings from wartime enmity. Arrival in Germany delivered profound shock even for women who had tried to prepare themselves psychologically for what they would find. The devastation exceeded anything they had imagined, despite newsreels and newspaper accounts. Hamburg, where Else Kruger's ship docked, was a landscape of ruins. Entire neighborhoods reduced to rubble, bridges destroyed, the harbor choked with sunken vessels, survivors living in basements and makeshift shelters, food shortages creating near-starvation conditions. The breakdown of basic services, water, electricity, sewage, sanitation, disease spreading through populations weakened by malnutrition and exposure. The contrast with the America they had just left could not have been more devastating. They had departed a nation of overwhelming abundance, where even prisoners of war ate better than most Germans, where waste was routine, where productive capacity seemed unlimited. They returned to a homeland of desperate scarcity, where survival consumed all energy, where every resource was desperately precious, where reconstruction seemed impossible given the scale of destruction. Kruger's diary entries from her first weeks back in Germany expressed sentiments shared by many repatriated prisoners. She wrote of feeling she had traveled not just across an ocean, but between different civilizations separated by centuries of development. America's industrial capacity, democratic institutions, and material abundance seemed incomprehensible when viewed from the ruins of Hamburg. Germany had challenged this colossus and been utterly destroyed for its hubris. The mathematical certainty of defeat that intelligence analysts had documented in captured supply charts was now written in destroyed cities and starving populations. The repatriated women faced difficult reintegration into German society. They had served the Nazi regime, operated communications equipment that facilitated German military operations, and supported a government now recognized as criminal by international consensus. Yet they had also experienced transformation through captivity that left them changed in fundamental ways. They had learned English, gained education, and witnessed alternatives to Nazi ideology. They had observed women exercising professional authority, experienced treatment as individuals rather than racial categories, and encountered democratic institutions functioning effectively. Some former prisoners became advocates for democratic reconstruction in post-war Germany. Their first-hand experience of American society, their understanding of democratic principles gained through observation rather than propaganda, and their ability to speak credibly about what they had witnessed made them valuable voices during Reconstruction. Anna Richter, who had studied business administration through correspondence courses during captivity, used her education and English language skills to work with American occupation authorities administering relief programs. Her ability to bridge German and American perspectives, to translate not just language but cultural concepts, made her effective in facilitating reconstruction efforts. Others focused on rebuilding their personal lives in a devastated nation. Greta Hoffmann used medical training gained at Camp Como to work in German hospitals desperately short of qualified personnel. The techniques she had learned from American nurses, the understanding of modern medical practices she had gained, and the broader perspective on healthcare she had developed, served German patients who benefited indirectly from her captivity experience. The women's stories gradually merged into the larger narrative of German Reconstruction and the economic miracle that would transform West Germany in the 1950s. The knowledge gained in American captivity, both by male and female prisoners, contributed to this transformation in ways both direct and subtle. Agricultural methods observed on American farms were implemented in German agriculture. Industrial techniques witnessed in American factories influenced German manufacturing. Management practices learned in American organizations shaped German business culture. Democratic principles experienced firsthand informed political reconstruction. The specific experience of female prisoners added dimensions to this knowledge transfer that male prisoners could not provide as fully. Understanding of women's roles in modern economies informed policies about female education and workforce participation. Recognition that women could exercise professional authority influenced social changes regarding gender roles. Awareness that societies could progress toward greater equality while maintaining stability challenged assumptions about necessary social hierarchies. The payment of wages to German women prisoners, the policy that had initially seemed so incomprehensible, exemplified principles that would shape post-war German development. Workers, even prisoners, even enemies, even women, possessed economic value that deserved compensation. Labor created wealth that should be shared with those who performed it. Economic systems that recognized worker dignity and provided appropriate compensation functioned more effectively than those based on coercion and exploitation. These principles, demonstrated through the simple act of paying prisoners 80 cents per day, contradicted Nazi economic doctrine and pointed toward the social market economy that would characterize West German reconstruction. The Marshall Plan, announced in June 1947, provided massive American aid for European reconstruction, including substantial assistance to occupied Germany. Former prisoners who had witnessed American productive capacity understood that such generosity was possible because America's industrial abundance made it sustainable. They could explain to skeptical Germans that American aid was not temporary charity that would create dependency, but rather investment in European recovery that would benefit all parties through restored trade and stability. The women who had been paid to work in American prison camps became living testimony that former enemies could be treated with dignity, that economic cooperation could replace military conflict, and that democratic capitalism, despite its flaws and contradictions, could generate prosperity more effectively than authoritarian systems. Their experience, combined with that of hundreds of thousands of male German prisoners, created a generation with first-hand knowledge of American society and genuine understanding of democratic principles. The long-term impact of the prisoner of war experience on German society remains difficult to quantify precisely, but clearly significant in aggregate. Opinion surveys conducted in West Germany during the 1950s showed that former prisoners of war held substantially more favorable views of the United States and democratic institutions than Germans without such experience. Political participation rates were higher among former prisoners. Support for NATO membership and Atlantic Alliance was stronger. Advocacy for democratic reforms found receptive audiences among those who had experienced American democracy firsthand. The specific contributions of female prisoners, while smaller in absolute numbers, carried particular importance for social changes regarding gender roles and women's status. Women who had observed American female professionals exercising authority advocated for expanded educational opportunities for German women. Those who had experienced economic independence through wages earned in captivity supported policies allowing married women to work and control their own earnings. The recognition that societies could afford women greater freedom without social collapse informed reforms that gradually expanded women's rights in West German society. The story of German women prisoners who couldn't believe they were paid to work in American camps ultimately illustrates truths that transcend their specific historical moment. The treatment of defeated enemies reveals victors' character more than any propaganda. Exposure to functioning democratic institutions and prosperous market economies can transform ideological conviction more effectively than coercion or re-education programs. Simple acts of decency toward those who lack power to demand such treatment demonstrate principles that inspire lasting loyalty more than military force ever could. The 32 women who stepped off that transport truck in Mississippi in September 1945, expecting brutality, exploitation, and confirmation of Nazi propaganda about American society, experienced instead an 18-month education in alternatives to authoritarianism. They learned that democratic societies, despite evident flaws and contradictions, could function effectively and generate abundance. They discovered that women could exercise professional authority and maintain economic independence. They witnessed that former enemies could be treated with dignity and humanity. They experienced transformation through simple exposure to reality that contradicted ideology. The payment they received for their labor, 80 cents per day in camp scrip, represented principles that shaped the post-war order. Workers deserve compensation for their efforts. Economic systems that recognize human dignity function more effectively than those based on exploitation. Even defeated enemies, even women whom Nazi ideology had relegated to subordinate status, possessed value that merited acknowledgement and appropriate reward. These principles, demonstrated through the mundane operation of American prison camps, contributed to reconstruction of Germany as a democratic nation allied with the United States. The women who returned to Germany carrying these lessons became part of the foundation for Europe's post-war transformation. They had witnessed the arsenal of democracy not through military defeat, but through daily experience of American abundance and democratic functionality. They had learned that the most powerful weapon in democracy's arsenal was not military might, but the simple, overwhelming evidence of free society's capacity to create prosperity while maintaining human dignity. Their transformation from Nazi auxiliary personnel to advocates for democratic reconstruction demonstrated that sometimes the greatest victories are won not through destruction but through demonstration, not through conquest but through conversion, not through hatred but through humanity. The German women prisoners were shocked by American industrial might and prisoner treatment, but ultimately they were transformed by it. And in that transformation lay seeds of reconciliation and reconstruction that helped build a better world from the ruins of total war. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.